In 1838, the British East India Company sent an army into Afghanistan, believing loyalty could be purchased and power could be controlled without permanent occupation. Tribal leaders accepted British gold. A king was installed under British supervision. Roads and supply lines were secured. On paper, the operation succeeded. 3 years later, that same army was almost completely destroyed during its retreat. This is not the story of a single military failure. It is the story of how indirect rule reshapes leadership, how dependency replaces legitimacy, and how empire collapses when influence is mistaken for control. In the late 1830s, British officials in India viewed Afghanistan primarily as a strategic buffer. To the north, the Russian Empire was expanding through Central Asia. British policymakers feared that Russian influence in Kabul could eventually threaten India, the most valuable possession of the British Empire. Afghanistan itself offered no economic benefit, but its location made it strategically important. The British objective was not to annex Afghanistan. Direct occupation was considered too expensive and too risky. Instead, the East India Company planned to control Afghan politics indirectly by managing its leadership. This approach had worked across India, where local rulers governed under British oversight while remaining formally autonomous. To achieve this, the British decided to remove Afghanistan's ruler, Dost Muhammad Khan, and replace him with Shah Shuja, a former king living in exile under British protection. Shah Shuja was expected to rule with British support and align Afghan policy with British interests. In 1839, British and Indian forces entered Afghanistan. Military resistance was limited. Kandahar fell without a fight. Ghazni was captured through a direct assault. Kabul was occupied, and Shah Shuja was installed as king. British officials declared the mission successful and assumed Afghanistan had been stabilized. Rather than ruling directly, the British relied on a system of subsidies. Tribal leaders were paid to secure roads, protect supply lines, and avoid resistance. These payments were presented as cooperation agreements, but they functioned as instruments of control. Leaders who accepted subsidies gained British recognition and protection. Those who resisted faced military punishment. At first, many leaders viewed this arrangement as temporary. Accepting British money appeared safer than resisting a powerful army. Leaders believed they could cooperate without surrendering long-term independence. However, the effects of these agreements were deeper than expected. Over time, authority began to shift. Leaders who relied on British subsidies reorganized their power around that support. Their rivals could no longer challenge them freely. Leadership that once depended on tribal consensus and personal authority increasingly depended on British approval. While leaders remained in place, the source of their legitimacy changed. In Kabul, Shah Shuja quickly discovered that kingship under British patronage came with severe limitations. He could not appoint officials freely. He could not raise taxes without British consent. His military depended on British officers. His foreign relations were entirely controlled by the British. Afghan elites understood that sovereignty had been replaced by dependency. British officials believed they had created a stable system. Subsidies were paid regularly. Roads remained open. The capital appeared secure. British officers settled into routine administration, convinced that Afghanistan could be managed like a princely state in India. However, Afghanistan produced no revenue. Maintaining troops, paying subsidies, and supplying Kabul placed increasing strain on company finances. The occupation generated costs but no profit. By 1841, company officials began questioning whether the arrangement was sustainable. In an attempt to reduce expenses, British authorities cut subsidy payments to tribal leaders. This decision undermined the entire system. Leaders had reorganized their authority, obligations, and rivalries around British support. Reducing payments weakened those leaders and signaled declining British commitment. Resentment spread rapidly. Cooperation began to collapse. Leaders who had depended on British backing found themselves exposed. Many reassessed their positions. Some quietly withdrew cooperation. Others openly turned against the British. In Kabul, unrest escalated into violence. A British political officer, Alexander Burnes, was killed by a mob. British commanders underestimated the scale of the uprising and failed to respond decisively. This hesitation further weakened British authority. As British power appeared uncertain, tribal leaders adjusted their positions once again. Loyalty that had been purchased vanished. The system of indirect control collapsed as quickly as it had been constructed. In early 1842, British authorities agreed to evacuate Kabul. Negotiations promised safe passage for the withdrawing force. A large column of soldiers, families, and camp followers began moving toward India. The retreat passed through territory controlled by leaders who had previously accepted British subsidies. Those agreements no longer held. Attacks began almost immediately. Supply lines failed. Coordination broke down. The column was repeatedly harassed and ambushed. The withdrawal turned into a catastrophe. Nearly the entire force was destroyed. Soldiers, civilians, women, and children were killed or captured. Only one European survivor reached safety. The defeat shocked Britain and exposed the limits of imperial control. Later in 1842, British forces returned briefly to Afghanistan to punish resistance and restore military prestige. Kabul was reoccupied temporarily. After punitive actions, the British withdrew again, abandoning the attempt to control Afghanistan through indirect rule. Although the occupation failed, its effects remained. Afghan leaders had learned how imperial power operated through subsidies, recognition, and selective force. British influence continued along the frontier through negotiated arrangements rather than occupation. The system attempted in Afghanistan became a model elsewhere in the British Empire. Local leaders were preserved in name, but transformed into intermediaries. Authority increasingly depended on external backing rather than internal legitimacy. This approach reduced costs and resistance in many regions, even as it reshaped traditional leadership structures. The consequences extended far beyond the 19th century. Systems of indirect control, negotiated authority, and financial dependency continued under different names after empire formally ended. Afghanistan resisted permanent control, but the mechanisms introduced during the occupation influenced frontier policy for decades. The lesson was clear. Empire could enter a valley, but it could not control it without legitimacy. Loyalty purchased with money lasted only as long as power appeared permanent. When that illusion collapsed, the system built upon it collapsed as well.